Hello and welcome again to TelecomTV. I'm Martin Warwick and we're here in Dusseldorf in Germany at the SDN and OpenFlow World Congress 2014. And I'm talking with Chris Wright of Red Hat, and Red Hat is based in sunny Oregon in the United States. Sunny Portland indeed. Chris, thanks for talking to us. I'd like to talk to you about open source, which is your area of expertise and particular interest. In the past, as you well know, in the telecom space, tier one carriers and others, service providers, etc., generally had a pretty cozy relationship with the people who supplied them with kit, the vendors, yes. But they were generally, once they were in the loop with them, they were in it forever. They were locked in many cases. Most of the time that was fine, sometimes it wasn't. Now with SDN and NFV, we're seeing the protagonists, the carriers and so on, kicking back against what used to be and saying, look guys, this is new technology, it's affecting the organizations we work for profoundly. We don't want to be locked in anymore, we want this to be open source. How much of a reality do you think that is?
I think it's an absolute reality. The question might be when. So are we there today? In some cases, you're actually seeing the beginnings of things transitioning from proof of concept to production, but we're at the beginning of a transformation. This is a journey that will take years, and open source is at the bottom of this. Open source is giving the end user, or in this case, the service provider, the ability to choose functionality without being locked to a particular vendor. They're basing their solutions on a set of common infrastructure that could come from any vendor.
What effect, I can see the benefits of that for the carriers and the service providers, what effect is it having on the vendor community?
Well, the vendor community is trying to figure out how they can remain relevant in a space where they've owned a very specific relationship with their customers. And there's some disruption possible in this change, in this transformation. So they want to be a part of that. I always like to say, it's safer to disrupt yourself than to be blindsided. So it's important for them to be a part of this transformation, and they certainly have the relationships and the experience to help guide on one aspect of the technology. And companies like Red Hat or developers in the open source community are helping provide guidance on how do you do open source and how do you bring open source to a new market.
We'll talk more about open source in a moment, but I'd like to begin by asking you about the sort of the standardization bodies that are out there that we've seen in the past working in a particular way. Do you think with NFV and SDN things are changing? Because the standards bodies are still there. ETSI, for example, is very, very pertinent to what's going on at the moment with SDN and NFV. What's their positions in this fluxing world?
Well, I think historically we had a relationship between customers and vendors and SDOs where customers would sort of express their requirements via a standard, point to that standard to their vendors and say, I want one of those. Yeah. Now in this open source development model, we can say standards are still important, interoperability is built around standardization, but we can also go directly to the communities that are building the software that we want our solutions developed on and say, this is the functionality that I need. Maybe express this through a white paper or standards requirements efforts that you see out of ETSI, for example. The open flow protocol is a protocol definition, but the open source implementation is a key component that sort of helps create de facto standardization in the gray areas or the corners that aren't always well specified.
Exactly. What you mentioned interoperability, which brings me nicely to my next question, Chris, which is with the difference that SDN and NFV are making and the fact that they're not going to be service providers won't be as tied in as they were previously. The industry now, and they must now be able to stitch together various modules and make the whole thing work to their advantage. How do they go about doing that?
Well, that begins with a relationship with a variety of vendors. In some cases, you might have vendors that can lead the way and help be the integration point for these various solutions. And I think that this is the kind of technology that we see in the IT world. where you pick and choose your favorite solution. How do you want to build your infrastructure? You find the key components that solve your problems and you bring those together. Is that done internally? Are you your own systems integrator? Do you have a relationship with a systems integrator? These are interesting questions that I think will evolve over the course of the transformation from where we are now to the future of NFE.
What about this new supply chain taking form then via open source? Is it underway? Are the links being forged? How long is it?
There absolutely are links being forged, and this is an interesting space that I personally spend a lot of my time in. You look at the SDO effort with ETSI and FE. It's specifying a reference architecture. It's giving us some idea of what the problem statements are, trying to define some of the key components to solving this problem statement. Taking that and bringing that to an open source community is actually challenging, because you have a collaborative group of developers who speak a language that's unique to their project. In most cases, that language is very far away from a telco language. They don't understand NFVI or Vim. They've never heard of an ETSI reference architecture diagram. So translating those requirements into something that's meaningful to an open source community is something that we're working on right now. We've launched a project called OPNFE. A big component of OPNFE is taking the ETSI reference architecture diagram, pulling the requirements out of that, and translating that into a language that's familiar to the developers who are going to need to change their source code to meet those requirements.
Because the new technologies began life really in the data center, did they not?
Absolutely, right.
And now we're seeing this transmogrify, move across, emigrate to the telco space, the global telco space, and it is, in many ways, they talk completely separate languages.
Yeah, and in fact, it goes the other direction as well. So we're bringing this data center IT technology to the telco world. And this is a world that doesn't have a DevOps language. They don't understand the same kind of agility, software changes that you see in the IT space. And the service providers are seeing massive change, rapid change, new services popping up all the time in the web space. And it's absolutely valuable to them. And so I think we're kind of meeting each other in the middle. We're informing each other of our different languages.
What about project examples? It's fine talking about theory. Anybody can do that. When it comes to the hey boys, hey, and the nitty gritty, it's what have you actually done? Show me something concrete, real that's working now. Can you tell us something about the projects that you've been working on?
Well, I work in some projects that are key foundational elements for the NFVI and the Vim. So for example, Linux, KVM, Open Daylight, Open vSwitch. These are all kind of foundational OpenStack. These are foundational technologies that are currently being modified to meet these NFV specific requirements and put together, assembled, integrated, and delivered in a variety of POCs. So we're here at SDN and OpenFlow World Congress. There's the POC hall, and many of these are built out of exactly those components. Exactly
so. So the proof of concept that we're seeing, the POC zone as it's called here, that is reality, yes?
That is reality, and it's the beginning. There are still functional gaps. There's feature additions that we need to do to improve the efficiency of the platform or add maybe specific functionality to meet the orchestration or monitoring requirements of a service provider. But the building blocks are there. They're being assembled today. They're being deployed absolutely in POCs, and in some cases you're seeing early production pilots based out of these open source software components.
We are seeing the end of the first epoch, the first era, first part of NFV, and we're moving from the informative to the normative, which is a lot of what is happening here and has been happening at other fora. What about going from proof of concept to small-scale trial, large-scale trial, and then deployment in a carrier network? How far away is that?
That's a good question. I'm afraid to make a prediction because it will only be wrong, but I think that I think one of the ideas is that we don't want to do a wholesale changeover. So we need to bring these technologies into the network slowly. So we pick key areas that can be virtualized, work on those, build confidence, build an operational understanding of how to operate your network with an NFV platform. And is that a year away? Is that 2 years away? Is that 5 years away? I think massive transformation takes a long time. The beginnings are starting now, and I think we'll see more and more POCs into pilot programs, into actual user-facing services over the course of the next year or two.
As soon as that.
Yeah.
A final question then. If you were faced with the responsibility, the choice, the determination to pick one area or a couple of areas that you would start to work on first in terms of providing trial, wide-scale deployment of NFE, what would it be? What would they be?
Well, what we're seeing is two concrete examples of what to virtualize, what VNFs are interesting to service providers, the virtual CPE and the virtual EPC. So these are areas that you'll see a lot of POCs about, the virtual EPC and virtual CPE, and they're sort of, in some cases it's low-hanging fruit, in some cases it's actually quite complicated, and it puts a lot of stress on this platform and is bringing the set of new requirements to these open source projects that are interesting and hard, and I think that's what's the fun part of evolving this platform to meet a new market's requirements.
Interesting, really interesting, different take, because you're there down in the nuts and bolts of it all, as it were, the virtual nuts and bolts of it all anyway. So Chris Wright, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.